New Beginnings, written by SparkandSmile, and read for you by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary. Izuku is 4 years old when he is diagnosed quirkless. His mother receives an x-ray of his feet and the worst news of her life. Izuku receives the first in a long line of dismissive glances, and new shoes to better fit his quirkless feet. The doctor is not technically wrong, in the same way that someone who said a sheathed knife is not sharp is not technically wrong. Izuku is 4 years old when he is diagnosed quirkless. His mother receives an x-ray of his feet and the worst news of her life. Izuku receives the first in a long line of dismissive glances and new shoes to better fit his quirkless feet. The doctor is not technically wrong, in the same way that someone who says a sheathed knife is not sharp is not technically wrong. Izuku's father rages at the news, calls Izuku useless and his mother a failure, and leaves after Izuku bites him for hitting his mother. Izuku is quietly relieved. His father had rarely been around to begin with, and when he was, he'd left bruises and the smell of smoke in his wake. Inko is devastated. She loved Hisashi more than anything. Home is better after he leaves. If Inko resents Izuku's quirklessness for causing Hisashi to vanish, she never shows it. Though Izuku hears her sobbing down the phone after he's supposed to be asleep, begging him to come home, please. School is worse. In a quiet, sardonic part of his 4-year-old mind, Izuku thinks his quirklessness didn't change anything, just swapped the good and bad parts around. Then Kachan says, "You'll never be a hero without a quirk, Deku." And Izuku changes his mind. His teachers hate him at worst, look down on him at best. His and Kachan's friends become Kachan's friends. His grades plummet because there's no way a quirkless child could outperform a quirked one. He must be cheating. He comes home with bruises and burns and reprimands for his teachers, and doesn't show any of them to his mother. Izuku loves his mother with all his heart, but even at 4 years old, he knows his job is to protect her, to be her hero. Life enters a holding pattern for about 7 years, until Inko slices open her hand cooking when Izuku opens the door with a bang, a hole burned right through his top. Inko looks at her baby and bursts into tears. Inko loves her son. Inko isn't blind. Inko has no idea how to help him. Izuku panics. His mother is bleeding a lot. She's bleeding a lot. And crying? He doesn't know what to do. He's holding his mother's hand now, trying to remember what the first aid videos he watched online said to do, when internally he feels something click into place. A moment later, in the worst pain of his life washes over him, and Inko watches as her baby seems to fall apart. Literally. His body blurring and cracks forming across his skin, before each jigsaw piece of him slots back together again, and Izuku is gripping her hand like his life depends on it. Inko rushes her baby to the hospital, so fast she forgets to put her outdoor shoes on. They're almost halfway there before she remembers to pull out a hanky to wrap her hand in, only to nearly go catatonic as Izuku is. Her hand is fine. Her hand is covered in blood, sure, but there's no sign of any injury. In fact, Inko flexes her hand as much as possible with it still trapped in Izuku's death grip. It feels better than before. The creaking and slight pain she'd felt ever since she, Hisashi, had broken her wrist by getting it caught, slamming it in the door. When they get to the hospital, Inko is a stuttering mess. Izuku is still frozen apart from when he's prodded to move. The nurse at the emergency room reception takes one look at Izuku's shoes, another at the Quirk NA on his card, and informs Inko there are people seriously hurt, and if she insists on being seen for imaginary problems, she'll just have to wait. Inko refrains from bursting into angry tears by dint of sheer dehydration and drags Izuku to sit in the waiting room next to a crying 2-year-old who learnt to float today and consequently broke her leg when she fell. Izuku, his head hurting more than it ever has in his life, including the time Kachan accidentally, purposefully, set off an explosion too close to his face and left him deaf in one ear for 3 days, reaches out to the little girl on autopilot. She goes quiet as her leg straightens out before yawning and curling into her mother's lap. Izuku revels in the silence for a moment, even if his leg hurts as well as his head now. Before it all goes away, suddenly people are stampeding trying to get to him. His mother clutches him to her side. They are suddenly swarmed by people. The voices are overlapping as they try to talk to him. "Hey kid, you healed that little girl, right? Please, my baby, he's sick." Izuku, overwhelmed, presses himself into his mother's side as he tries desperately to sort through all the chaos and make it manageable, even as his headache seems to grow worse. To Inko and Izuku, the chaos seems to last hours as they cling to each other desperately. In reality, the whole thing lasts less than a minute, before a doctor pushes their way through, uses their quirk, some kind of voice projection, or attention attractor. Izuku isn't sure, though that part of him longs for his notebook to work it out, to quiet everyone down. They look at Izuku, attention catching briefly on his bright red shoes. Shoes Izuku is just now realising suddenly feel far too wide, before asking, "Now, one at a time, what happened here?" "He healed my little girl," cries a woman sitting next to Izuku, still clutching the fast-asleep child. The doctor nods, looking to Inko then. "I assume this is the first time his quirk has manifested." They ask Inko, who nods. "We thought he was diagnosed as quirkless years ago, but an hour ago or so, he healed my hand, and now this little girl." The doctor nods again, completely unsurprised. "It's a good thing you came here then. Healing quirks can have all kinds of side effects. We'll have to get you and the girl checked out, as well as your son." The mother of the little girl looks frightened then. "Is my daughter going to be all right?" she asks. "I'm sure she'll be fine. It's just better to be cautious in these cases." They turn to Inko. "You better come along. We don't want the mob here getting riled up and going for his son again." Things progress quickly after that. Actually, Izuku's not sure he's ever had a better hospital trip. When he mentions he has a headache, they give him pills immediately, and actually tell him to let them know if they aren't enough. He has his blood drawn, an ultrasound of where his appendix used to be. Everything is going fine, until they lead him into the next room, and his mother takes off his shoes. They slip off without even needing the laces undone, and the doctor tells him they need to x-ray his feet. Two things happen in quick succession. Izuku learns he has a fear of x-rays, and something in him clicks into place. The next moment, a wave of pain washes over him, worse than the last, and Izuku feels something pulse out of him, even as the world goes dark. To his mother and the doctor, Izuku suddenly leaps to his feet, looking panicked, before his whole body seems to split apart, hanging in the air like a thick mist, larger pieces still recognisable. Inko sees her son's eye, staring out a piece of his face, before he falls back together and every electronic device in the room goes dark. In the silence, the sound of Izuku's body hitting the floor is audible. The doctor opens the door, but the corridor outside is dark. A few more moments pass before the lights flicker back on, and Inko screams. The floor underneath Izuku is slick with blood. Izuku wakes up in an unfamiliar bed, feeling like he's been hit by 6 of Kachan's strongest explosions. Immediately, his stomach begins to churn, and he barely manages to roll to his side of his bed before his stomach attempts to exit his body via his mouth. The gagging sounds startle his mother out of her doze. Almost immediately, she is rubbing Izuku's back and calling for a doctor. By the time they've rushed in, Izuku's mostly done, and is instead hanging half of his body out of the bed, completely lacking the energy he needed to pull himself back up. Fortunately, he doesn't need to, as a pair of nurses manhandle him back onto the bed. "Izuku, honey, are you all right?" his mother demands, hands fluttering about him, unsure whether or not she can touch him without making things worse. "Mom?" Izuku blinks leerily at her. "What happened? You were bleeding? We're at the hospital. Are you okay?" His mother bursts into tears, the heel of her palm sweeping under her eyes, but she nods. "I'm okay, sweetie. We're here for you. You hurt yourself." Frowning, Izuku tries to make sense of the fuzzy memories. "Did I?" He almost doesn't want to say it, afraid if he acknowledges it, then this miracle will disappear on him. "Did I heal you?" "You did a little more than that, young man," a new voice cuts in, stirring vague memories in Izuku of being steered around the entire hospital as they ran test after test on him. "How is that possible?" Izuku said at last. "I'm quirkless." There's half a decade's worth of pain in the word. Izuku braces himself subconsciously for the worst, for his mother and him to be thrown out of the hospital. Instead, the doctor just nods, holding up a set of paper. "That's what the DNA sequences and the X-ray shows, not to mention the appendix we removed when you were 8. Izuku frowns, even more confused now. Then how? He's cut off by the doctor continuing. "On the other hand, this set of blood showed clear signs of the quirk gene." They shake a different set of papers. "And this one shows another expression of the gene. Not to mention, I saw you grow a new toe joint with my own eyes after you fainted on us." Now that the doctor mentioned it, Izuku's feet really ache. He suddenly feels a great deal of empathy for his mother. "Speaking of," Inko clears her throat. "What does that mean, doctor?" "Our current theory is this. Midoriya-kun's quirk is rewriting his DNA on the fly to provide him with access to various quirks. How it's doing that, how it's picking what quirk is unknown right now." Inko does her best to take that in stride, nodding. "Why did he collapse earlier, though?" The doctor shrugs. Inko wishes they'd been given a doctor with a better bedside manner, but frankly, this is the best a hospital has treated Izuku in years. At a guess, pulling apart every cell in his body and rewriting it is a bit too taxing for him to do multiple times in quick succession. Izuku remembers the pain he'd felt before healing his mother, before passing out, and shudders. Then he shakes himself out of it. Who cares if his quirk hurts a bit? He has a quirk, a strong one. He can be a hero, just like All Might. His mother looks worried. His quirk hurt him, though. He's collapsed. He wasn't moving. There was blood everywhere. Before Izuku can reassure her, the doctor notices and smiles at her. It's not a pretty smile, but Izuku's had a lot of practice reading people since he didn't get his quirk, trying to work out if they were the kind of person who'd hurt him or not. He's pretty sure this is the doctor's version of a kind smile. "Don't worry, Midoriya-san. In this case, the fact that Midoriya-kun collapsed is actually a good thing. It means his quirk will cut him off before he's able to do too much damage to himself. Despite how worrying what happened earlier was, he was actually perfectly fine physically. Even the blood loss looked a lot worse than it was, due to how spread out it was. Inko still looked worried, but less so now. The doctor just smiled wider. In this case, I would recommend a cautious experimentation with your quirk. It likely came in late as another safety measure, to prevent you from damaging yourself. Control will be key. You'll be quite capable once you're able to control it fully. Inside Izuku's mind, soft laughter echoes for a moment. Outside he asks, "Can I go home then?" It takes nearly half a day, at least an hour of which Izuku spends convincing his mother that he is okay. But eventually Izuku is checked out of the hospital and sat in a desk in his room. In the flat beyond, Inko nervously dials a familiar number. Izuku is unaware of that, however. Instead he's opening a new notebook, the first in his new series, My Quirk Analysis. He taps the first page. The doctor at the hospital had given him the forms to update his quirk registration, mostly filled in, but the name for his quirk had been left blank. That was up to him. He's not sure. There's still so much he doesn't know about his quirk that he's not sure what it should be called. In the end, he settles on the simplest name he can think of. Multitool. That done, he hands the papers to his mother, who's hovering outside his room, and tells him to go to sleep. He starts filling out his notebook with everything he can think of about his new quirk. In the end, it's more questions than answers, but Izuku thinks he's got enough to get started with what the doctor called cautious experimentation with his quirk. First, of course, he has to figure out how to activate it. Both times he's done it previously have been instinctive, panicked responses. Izuku tries to remember the feeling, but most of what he gets is the overwhelming pain that followed. He stares at his hands. He tries shooting them out in front of him, like he'd seen Kachan do when activating his own quirk. Nothing. Maybe it's emotion-based? Izuku pulls out his phone and loads a video of a bunch of baby sloths, then never fails to overwhelm him with adorableness. Still nothing. Thinking back, he was pretty panicked both times he activated his quirk. Maybe that's the key? He successfully manages to work himself up, thinking about going back to school on Monday, but no new power springs into place. Izuku thumps his head down onto his desk. Closing his eyes, he tries to come up with an idea. Instead, he's greeted with the strong mental image of a closed hand. Mentally shrugging, Izuku reaches out. The hand rotates, dropping what it was holding into Izuku's waiting palm. It hits, and Izuku feels the rapidly becoming familiar wave of pain wash over him. He's not sure what the quirk he just got does at first. Then, a drop of blood splashes onto the page of his notebooks, and thoughts start to crowd his mind. Blood splatter indicates a drop of less than 2 inches, indicating it is sourced from our face, likely the nose based off the smell of blood. Conclusion: not fully recovered from earlier quirk use. Further use of primary quirk likely to result in injury. Izuku's head starts to throb from having 2 trains of thought going on at once, his own and this new one. He tries to think about what this new quirk is, but it just doesn't stop rattling off deductions. Current quirk, mental-based, enhancement of natural ability to extrapolate based on evidence, or limited precognition triggered by finding clues. The light from under his door flickers briefly. Izuku barely has time to notice it before. Change in light source not caused by fluctuations in the energy grid. Too slow. Not caused by damage to the circuit. Mother is outside the door. She is worried. She will check during the night. If she enters the room, she will see the blood and insist on returning to the hospital. Izuku's head is killing him now. This quirk is damaging to use long-term. Unfamiliarity with the quirk implies inability to shut down. Conclusion: quirk will remain until enough damage is sustained to pass out. Sound will alert Mother, who will insist on returning to the hospital. Somehow, Izuku wrenched control of his brain long enough to drop the quirk. He sat panting at the desk, blood dripping slowly from his nose onto his notebook, his head throbbing in time with the pulse of his feet aching. After a few more drops of blood splashed down onto his notebook, Izuku gathers himself enough to grab some tissues. One hand holds a bunch to his face, while the other mops the blood as much as he can manage off his notebook. Time passes. At last, Izuku picks up a pen and starts a new page in his notebook. Quirk 3. Insight. In the end, Izuku barely manages to stagger over to his bed before he falls asleep, head pleasantly empty of thoughts, all of them tucked away in his notebook. He doesn't wake until late the next day. Even then, it's only because his mother brings him breakfast and a gift. Izuku, feeling half-starved, inhales his breakfast before tearing open the envelope. It's a new ID card, the same dorky picture as before, same birthday, address, everything. It shouldn't mean anything, except at the bottom, in red, it reads, Quirk, Multitool. Izuku bursts into tears. It's a flimsy piece of plastic. It shouldn't mean anything. Izuku has spent the last 6 years being reminded every day that it means everything. In the end, Inko leaves Izuku in bed. He's under strict instructions to rest this weekend. She offers to bring in the computer, but Izuku assures her that he's happy with his phone and notebooks. He is, especially since he falls asleep long before he can get bored of them. Izuku drifts in and out all throughout Saturday and Sunday both. Normally he'd be upset about having missed the weekend, but he was just so tired. And besides, Izuku has a quirk now. Nothing could ruin his mood. By Monday, Izuku is well enough to go to school, though he's still a little tired. His mother tells him that she let the school know that he had a new quirk, and that they would assign a quirk counsellor to help him gain some control, so Izuku makes sure to bring his new notebook with him. At school, things are seemingly unchanged, yet completely different as well. His teachers don't seem to like him much. He's only been at middle school for a semester, but first impressions count, apparently. But when he gets his homework back, it's graded fairly, and when Kachan corners him in the desk between classes, the teacher doesn't intervene, but she doesn't punish Izuku for being disruptive either. As for Kachan, when things go wrong, they go wrong fast. The blonde boy is angry, palms popping in the way that makes Izuku want to curl up in a ball and go far away. "So, Deku," he hisses. "The hag says you've got a quirk now. Well, you might have fooled Auntie and the doctors, but you haven't fooled me. You're still the same lying, useless wannabe you always were." It's not a lie, Kachan, Izuku says, voice quiet and small. "I got a quirk. The doctor said it probably wasn't safe for me to use it earlier, so it got blocked." Kachan's hand send curls of smoke off Izuku's desk as he demands, "Oh yeah? Then prove it!" He grins challengingly, as if he'd caught Izuku out. Izuku gulps, but hesitantly closes his eyes, and reaches for that closed hand. A brief flash of pain, he thinks it's probably about the same level as the first time he used his quirk, and opens his eyes. The first thing he sees is Kachan's head falling off, followed by his arms and legs. Izuku screams. Kachan screams. The boys surrounding them scream. Izuku drops the quirk, still screaming. He doesn't stop until Kachan stands back up, seemingly fine, but backing away from Izuku. "What the hell, Deku? You some kind of villain? Only a villain would do that. You stay away from me or I'll kill you!" Izuku spends the next 50 minutes frozen in shock. Luckily, his teacher for the next period doesn't care enough to remember that he finished the worksheet from the last lesson, so Izuku is free to sit and panic. By the time the end of the day bell rings, Izuku has spent most of the day expecting to be dragged into the principal's office, to be expelled and then arrested. Instead, he is completely ignored by the teachers, and his classmates give him a wide berth. By the time he gets home, Izuku has silently promised himself and every deity he can think of that if he doesn't get sent to jail, he'll never use his quirk at Eldera again. It's not that big of a sacrifice. He hurt Kachan today, and Kachan is going to be an amazing hero, so Izuku needs to get his quirk under control, or he'll just be acting like a villain. Things at school settle eventually. Izuku's grades shoot up. Now the teachers no longer mark him down due to being too good for someone quirkless. He doesn't make friends. The other kids too used to hating him, and too spooked by what he did to Kachan, but they're all too frightened to get close to him too. So Izuku's bruises fade, until all that is left are the occasional ones from people throwing things at him and then ducking away. And the ones from Kachan. But that's different. It's Kachan. They're friends. He doesn't mean to, he just gets upset easily. Then, just when Izuku is getting used to good things, everything goes wrong. Because Hisashi comes home. It's been 7 years since Izuku saw him, 2 since they last heard from him, and now he's back. Oh, he's still rarely home, but the smell of smoke lingers in the air, and bruises linger on his mother's arms and Izuku's chest. Izuku will never forgive himself for not doing anything, for letting his mother brush him off with excuses about how she hurt herself, for pretending, his father was only hurting him. He keeps believing it, until he wakes up early one morning to the sound of breaking glass, and steps out of his room in time to see Hisashi backhand Inko. He's moving before he can think about it, dashing between his father and mother, arms spread wide. He sees sparks flicker at the back of his father's throat and panics, grabs his quirk and less accepts the offered quirk, then snatches it with both hands. Activating it in a flash, his eyes sting, but the fire in his father's throat dies, and Izuku nearly sobs with relief. He barely has time to try and puzzle out this new quirk Cancellation, before he is reminded that his father's fire is not the only threat the man poses. Hisashi grabs him by the throat, and Izuku jerks back, trying to escape, to curl into a ball and disappear. Then he nearly screams as pain washes over him. It feels like he's just grabbed another quirk, but when he reaches for it, he comes up empty. Hisashi drops him and hums. He turns to Inko. "Get this cleaned up. I'll be back later." Inko and Izuku stay frozen until the door slams behind him. Then Inko is reaching for Izuku, who is scrambling out of her reach. I need to go," Izuku gasps before fleeing to his room, curling up against the door. Inko doesn't attempt to follow, and eventually Izuku uncurls and reaches for his quirk. The hand feels shaky, and he doesn't think he can handle a new quirk just yet, but its presence is enough to make him sob in relief. He's not sure how his father knew to do that. Izuku normally dropped the quirk on purpose, or if he falls asleep, but he dropped them when scared, by Karchan enough times to be aware of the possibility. His father shouldn't be, though. Izuku hated to think it, but it was the only way he could have known as if Izuku or someone else he knew had told him. Izuku keeps his Quirk Analysis notebooks on him at all times, and the person who knew that secret was Inko. Izuku wasn't angry with his mother. He's hurt. He's furious. Why would she tell him he trusted her? But it's an upsetting thought. Still, Izuku is a forgiving person, and he knows Inko loves Hisashi. He understands loving someone who hurts you, who hurts others. So by the time a few hours have passed, Izuku watching the offering hand swap out one mystery quirk for another over and over again, he's calmed down enough to check his mother is all right, without letting any resentment creep into his tone. Inko has swept away the broken glass and is staring at the apartment door when Izuku walks back out. Izuku shoves down the pain he feels at that and goes over to check on Inko, who shakes herself out of her thoughts to gather Izuku close. Hisashi comes back eventually, and Izuku's quirk refuses to cooperate. Even as the man gets worse and worse, he tries desperately, reaching for a hand that isn't there, but his quirk is running scared, it seems. Later, Izuku will consider it a blessing, because with Izuku seemingly quirkless again, Hisashi seems to get bored with them again and starts leaving for longer and longer periods, until he stops coming back altogether. Izuku and Inko's lives return to their previous states, and if Izuku is quietly aware of the chain of unread messages Inko has sent to Hisashi, he says nothing. In turn, Inko says nothing when she sees Izuku quietly changing the locks to their apartment one day. By the time his final year of middle school starts, Izuku has managed to work out a few things about his primary quirk. 1. His quirk is at least a little bit sentient, protective, petty, and has a vicious sense of humour. 2. He can switch quirks about twice an hour without passing out. The recovery period lengthens the closer he gets to that limit, though. At 3, he has maybe 5 seconds to use before he passes out. Mutation quirks count as double. 3. He can only hold one quirk at once. Trying to hold more just results in him dropping the current one. 4. There is no way to see what quirk he is being offered before he accepts it. He's pretty sure he doesn't have much, if any, say in what it is. 5. When he grabs a quirk without already holding one, his body changes. His feet lose the extra joint. This makes him very glad that he had his appendix out when he was 10. His feet ache all the time now. And while he'd been able to build spring-loaded walls into his shoes to accommodate the changing size of his feet, he's not sure how he'd build a spring-loaded abdomen.